ain't got no woman now.
You are listening to Six Finger Learning with Jason Free.
Ain't got no woman now. Slept over last night. You don't need no woman no how.
Hey kids, it's Jason Free again, and you're back at Six Finger Learning. Awesome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Man, you guys are in for a real treat. The opening clip that you heard comes from a genuine blues pioneer, Victor Brox. And I'll talk about Victor in more detail later. But the purpose of this podcast is to kind of prove a point of a prior podcast where we were talking about how you as a student need to get off your ass and stop doing the same shit that you always do with your assignments. In particular, your essay assignments, your research assignments. You know, you got to stop using fucking Google. You got to stop, just being lazy and not understanding how you can invest your time to not only help you academically, but personally and professionally. And that's by conducting interviews. Prior to this series of interviews that we did with Victor Brox, and there you go back about 15 years ago, I started conducting interviews with people as I was going through my academic career, lawyers, doctors, teachers, artists, whoever. And what happened for me was essentially what you're going to see over the course of 6 different podcasts, not all back to back. We're going to drip feed them over the next several weeks, is you start developing relationships with these people. The people that you interview more times than not will get it, and they will understand it, and they will see the significance of it, and they will want to help you. They will want to share insights with you that you can't get from a book, that you can't get from an instructor. They will want to let you know about jobs coming up. They will want to let you know about how to avoid certain jobs. They will sign letters of recommendation. They will bend over backwards for you because they see that you genuinely care. And they can become the greatest resource in your academic career, beating out the vast majority of your teachers, and again, the vast majority of your textbooks. You're not really going to have a whole lot of textbooks moving forward. We're going to say, you know what? That fucking book changed my life. You might have an instructor who you can say that, but you'll be lucky. But if you go out, and I'm talking about in high school, definitely in college, and you start interviewing people, I'm saying like a half a dozen to a dozen a semester, you're going to have a lot of people who can change your life. You're going to have a lot of people who will share things with you that you could never get by sitting in a desk. So our purpose of presenting these interviews with Victor Brox are to show you that evolution. I'm going to have a lot of different interviews, and a few of them that we did multiple times, but nothing like Victor Brox. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of backstory. About 15 years ago, Six Finger worked with a variety of universities around the world, in particular within music business programs. We worked with NYU, with Catherine Moore in her graduate program, the absolute best. She's wonderful. Then we worked with Guy Morrow at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. He's a genius. And then we worked with Julia Jones at Canterbury Christ King Church, who is a real pioneer in touring and talent development. Well, we were working with them, and we were working with some other universities, just name dropping a little bit at the very beginning. Sorry about that. We were working with some other universities, and they were really asking us if we could get some content for them. Content that you can't get in a textbook. That's what we were known for. And we said, sure, what are you looking for? And they said, we're looking for a history of the blues. We're looking for somebody or a group of people who can talk about the importance and impact of the blues. And we said, okay, give us a little bit of time. Not knowing who the fuck we talked to, because we didn't have that kind of contact. We had a lot of contacts in the music industry, but not anybody who could go into the blues the way that they were asking. So amongst ourselves, we were trying to figure out a possible solution. And we got word through the grapevine that Victor Brox was going to be in Manchester. Now, that was a big deal because at the time, Victor wasn't living in Manchester. That's where he was born. That's where he's from. I'll go into more of his career later. But he was spending most of his time in the south of France with no phone, no internet connection, no anything. He was just down there playing the blues and being a bohemian artist almost. Well, he was coming up to Manchester because, unfortunately, his mother had passed away and he had to work on her affairs. So we had some contacts to reach out to him via his family, specifically his daughter, and asked if he would give us half an hour, 45 minutes. And he came back and said, sure. And what resulted from that connection is what you're going to hear today. His first interview, which of the 6 is by far the weakest of the interviews. Which, if you interview somebody more than once, you'll find out that their first interview is the weakest. Because number one, they don't really understand the format. They don't understand what you're trying to do. They haven't done it before. It's a little weird. But he still gave us gold, absolute gold. And at the end of the phone call, we said, thank you very much. Our condolences to your mother passing away. And he said, you know what? I didn't really feel good about that. I would like to do it again. Now, as you will hear, it wasn't a straight interview. We didn't ask him any questions. He just started going, and we were smart enough not to say anything. So we said, sure, what are you thinking about? He goes, let me put pen to paper and I'll try to come up with something that makes sense because I want to give these students, something that makes sense and something that they can understand the full power of the blues and its impact on the 20th century and even the 21st century. And we said, shit, Victor, sure, no problem. When would you like to do that? And he said, next week, same time, give me a call. So we gave him a call the next week, and it was a different world. He basically did it as a lecture, breaking things down into digestible chunks, showing you how different times and different geographic regions evolved the blues and how it was impacted by civil rights issues, how it was impacted by crime, how it was impacted by drugs, how it was impacted by all sorts of different things that bluesmen and women went through. And in a way that I would say nobody else on the planet can do. Because when he talked about a certain geographic region, he'd put the phone down and he'd pick up his guitar and he'd play to the phone. I mean, fuck me. That's what you hear at the beginning of this. That's not a 78. That's not a 45. That's Victor Brox putting down his beige handset on his desk, pulling out his guitar from like the 1930s and playing to show us, to show you the different styles of the blues. So he does that on his second interview. And he says, I got more. And we were like, holy shit, when would you like to do it? And he said, same time next week. We said, no problem. And as he went through, the whole thing was 6 different interviews. So he gave us 6 weeks of his time. As he goes through, the interviews get better and better and better. And I don't even want to call them interviews. They're monologues and performances. I mean, he puts the phone down when he talks about certain blues styles and talks about how the piano impacts it. And he puts down next to his piano and he starts fucking playing, just like what you heard at the very beginning of this. He'll talk about how Louisiana impacted it, and he'll bust out an accordion and start playing a fucking accordion and playing music. He has slide whistles. He has, all kinds of stuff. And he is belting it out as if he was performing for his life, like a real bluesman would do. Now, again, most of you are not going to need a Victor Brox to tell you about the history of the blues or to perform it. Most of you will need to talk to businessmen. Most of you will need to talk to teachers, lawyers, whatever the fuck you're going to become. And you're going to find a Victor Brox. You're going to find several of them. You're going to find people who expose their souls. Because if they are legit, and that's important, because you're going to find out the pretenders. You're going to see, you're going to hear, you're going to learn, this person's a joker, man. This person's a fucking waste of time. And you will probably politely not work with them anymore. But you're going to run across some Victor Brox-like people. I promise you, if you actually do this, if you actually make this a part of your new way of learning and drop the horseshit factory processes that you have endured over the course of your academic career, you will find Victor Broxes that will expose their soul, that will give you so much than you could ever imagine and more than you deserve, because we don't deserve this stuff. Nobody has these performances. Nobody has Victor Brox breaking down the blues but us at Six Finger. And that's pretty fucking awesome. And you can go out and do the very same thing. And you should go out if you really care about yourself. If you want to be a drone in the economic engine of America, then sit on your ass and just Google shit. If you want to be something real, something meaningful, if you want to have a chance at being fucking happy at your profession, you need to go out and start interviewing people and find your Victor Broxes. So let's talk about Victor Brox really quickly. He was born in Manchester. He has been part of the music, specifically blues scene, since the 60s. He has worked with countless musicians. Jimi Hendrix and Tina Turner both have said that he is their favorite white bluesman. He has worked with Keith Moon. He has worked with Eric Clapton. He has worked with Ritchie Blackmore. He has worked with all kinds of different people in quote-unquote modern music, but he also has done things like he was in the first stage production in London for Jesus Christ Superstar. He's actually been in a movie where he had a non-speaking role as Leonardo da Vinci. So just imagine Leonardo da Vinci playing the blues. And that gives you Victor Brox. So anyway, I've beaten the hell out of this. I think it's time for you to hear the first interview. And like I said, it's not the strongest one, but it's still gold. And if you're good boys and girls, and I know that you are, we'll be dropping those epic second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth interviews that include the performances. This one doesn't have a performance because, again, it was his first time with us. So I give you now Victor Brox.
My name is Victor Brox. I'm going to try to tell you in my own words and from my own experience the extraordinary adventure story of the blues. The blues is well over 100 years old and sprang from the humblest possible origins, but very soon developed into a majestic and classic form of universal expression. It has been called the only new art form of the 20th century, and has certainly wielded an extremely powerful influence over popular culture on a global scale. Some people lived for the blues, and some people died for it too. I'm thinking of Pinetop Smith, the barrel house pianist, shot to death in the middle of a boogie-woogie solo, and Sonny Boy Williamson, #1, who died with an ice pick in his brain at the back of Carnegie Hall. But blues isn't just a matter of life and death. It's far more than that. I first got into the blues in about 1951 when I was 10 years old. And by 1954, I was leading my own small group and trying to listen to everything I could possibly hear. Although at that time it was very difficult. There were no real bluesmen that one could hear in Manchester, in the north of England, and records were extremely few and far between. The LP record had never even been invented by that time. But then things changed because there was a greater opportunity to hear actual American musicians and bluesmen who came over. There had been visits, I believe, in the 30s by some of the famous jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong and Coleman Hawkins, but they had to come over as cabaret performers because there was a ban on exchange of musicians between the Musicians' Union in Britain and the Teamster unions in the United States. So it was almost impossible to hear the real thing. But all that changed in 1955 when a very wonderful blues singer and musician, writer, and wonderful diplomat, representative of the blues came over to Britain. And this was Jesse Willard Big Bill Brunsey. And I remember how impressed I was when I saw him. I was just a young teenager, but there's no way I was going to miss the chance of seeing my very first real bluesman. He was a very, very impressive figure, over 6'2", extremely handsome, had a wonderful way of speaking and talking, and a brilliant raconteur, and an extremely nice man as well, a real good man. He'd had lots of experience. He'd been playing. He'd had two separate careers, one as a leader of a kind of early style rhythm and blues band, backing musicians for Bluebird Records in the 30s and 40s, and then later reinventing himself as a folk singer when the folk boom came around in the 1950s. Playing for completely different audiences, of course. When he came over to England, he was backed by an English revival New Orleans band called the Chris Barber Jazz Band. And he was really good. He was wonderful. And I was later able to get quite a lot of records. But I never forget the way he sang and played. A brilliant guitarist and a beautiful, warm voice. And after that, we had visits by Muddy Waters, the great Chicago bluesman, and Otis Spann, the phenomenal Mississippi pianist. Muddy, of course, from Mississippi also. And they came over. They were also backed by the Chris Barber Jazz Band. And the following year was the first visit by the duo of Brownie McGhee and Sonny Terry, who I got to stay with. I got the chance to meet and play with all these people, and it was a real foundation of my career and interest in the blues, which I have continued right until the present day. After Brownie McGhee and Sonny Terry, gradually quite a stream of American bluesmen came over to Britain. There was a phenomenon called the American Blues and Gospel Festival, Blues and Gospel Caravan, which featured lots and lots of wonderful blues musicians. And they were almost always appearing in Manchester because there was a television company, television broadcasting company in Manchester. One of the guys in the company, Johnny Hamp, was a very, very big enthusiast in blues. So we used to get a lot of bluesmen, not just coming and visiting Manchester, but also electing sometimes to stay here after the blues caravan had gone back to America or gone back to Europe. They would quite often stay in Manchester. And as I say, I had a chance to stay with Brownie McGhee and Sonny Terry and learn quite a lot from them. And it wasn't long before I had my own band, the Victor Brox Blues Train, and we actually cut the very first English blues single on 45, which was called World in a Jug. Now, what about how did blues arrive? What do we know about the beginning of blues? Well, as I said at the beginning, blues is over 100 years old and is a combination music. It's a music that sprang originally from the evil of slavery. It's a synthesis, a crossover music which is fused from both African and European elements. And wherever slaves were settled, you would find a similar process at work. For example, in Brazil, the African music that was brought over by people that were landed in Sao Paulo and Rio, they combined their African origins with Portuguese music, possibly some Indian music from the Amazon as well, but mostly the Portuguese Catholic style of sanctified singing, because the only music they were allowed to play would be religious music, and out of that came the samba. And then, of course, in the Caribbean, you had two quite extraordinary forms of music that were fused from African origins with the storytelling of Ireland and Scotland, which was in Trinidad, where the calypso form sprung up, and in Jamaica, needless to say, they had the origins of ska and blue beat, which later gave way to reggae and, I guess, rap and so on after that. But of course, in America, the fusion that took place brought about the most famous and classic of all these fusion forms, and that was the blues. And slaves were not allowed very much freedom at all in the way they expressed themselves. Many of them were refused permission to learn to read and write, and for this reason the blues is very much part of an oral tradition. Nevertheless, although it came from the humblest possible origins, it's an extremely powerful mode of expression and was desperately needed by those who pioneered it. But it was a combination of many different things. The influences that formed blues were the remembered African melodic forms, which were probably similar to some of the prison songs that were still able to be heard right up until the 60s in some of the big prison farms down in the Mississippi Delta and Arkansas, and also probably very similar to some of the field horrors that were practiced by the mule skinners, people who led the mule trains when they were building the great levee which held back the Mississippi and basically drained the whole plains of Mississippi and made it possible to grow cotton and similar crops. So those are some of the African origins, plus of course the syncopated rhythm and the celebrated blues scale, in which the third and the seventh and sometimes the fifth note of the scale are slightly flattened. So you're singing in a kind of mode which is neither major nor minor, but a specifically blues melancholic feel. And these African elements were fused with the simple Protestant, Baptist hymn tunes and choruses of the Moody and Sankey Sanctified Hymn Book, which you'd find in Congregationalist, Baptist and Methodist churches, which slaves were forced to attend by their Irish, Welsh, English, of course American slave masters. And that's where they learned, that's where they were allowed to sing and allowed to actually play. Many of them learned some of the songs that were written, produced by minstrel shows, people like Stephen Foster, Camptown Races, Oh Susanna, songs like that, which were quite melodic and pleasant songs, and were influenced in their own way by black folk songs. And this influence of you could almost call it Celtic or English music, English church, Protestant chapel music, and the African rhythms, and especially the call and response or antiphony, where one voice is answered by another voice, became imbued in the way that black people sang. And after emancipation, they were encouraged to form their own groups and make their own instruments. In slavery, during slave times, intelligent musical slaves were often lent European instruments and taught to actually play them, so they could produce music specifically for dances on the great plantations. And of course they changed it a little bit and learned to incorporate their own forms of music into it, but they were still basically playing Western music. And then something happened which has a kind of geographic influence, really, because over on the eastern seaboard of the southern states, up from Mexico, came a new form of instrument, which was a steel-strung guitar. The guitar had never been used so much by the Afro-American people because it was simply too quiet to be of use if they wanted to sing outdoors, and mostly they had to sing outdoors because they only had very small shanties or cabins of their own. So if they wanted to hold a social function, it was an outdoor function, and acoustic guitars don't make too much of a sound. They invented their own instrument, which was the banjo, and many of the early minstrel shows and medicine shows were to banjo and washboard accompaniment. But with the advent of the steel-strung guitar, everything changed. That was brought by some of the Mexican vaqueros up from Mexico, found its way into Texas, and then across to Mississippi, and it was adopted by the itinerant street musicians and minstrel singers, and gradually replaced the banjo. Now, with the steel-strung guitar, there are a great many more possibilities than with the banjo, because you can hold the notes for longer, you can bend the strings, and you can, as they learned, play it with a broken neck of a bottle to slide over the strings in the manner of a Hawaiian guitar to imitate the human voice. And of course, it's much louder and can actually be heard on street corners, in the town and village squares. Of course, there wouldn't have been the kind of traffic that we have today, so the place would be much quieter, and somebody singing and playing quite loudly on a steel-strung guitar would have been much more audible. And this became current in the western and central southern states of the Gulf Coast, as I say, Texas, Mississippi, and then Tennessee and Arkansas. But over to the east, I'm talking about the western states, Texas, of course. Over to the east in Louisiana, over the swamplands of Louisiana, and then into New Orleans, there was another major influence. At the end of the Civil War, many of the Confederate Army bands had disbanded in New Orleans, and the junk shops were full of cheap second-hand brass band instruments. Now, there was already quite a tradition of extremely fine woodwind players. There was a conservatoire which was established by the French rulers of New Orleans, which was still part of France, especially for Creole musicians or mulatto people of mixed race, where they learned to play clarinet, oboe, flute, and so on. And then at the end of the Civil War, when the shops were flooded with these second-hand brass instruments, the tradition of brass bands, black brass bands arrived, marching bands, parade bands, and at the same time there was always a school of the New Orleans professor who played the piano. New Orleans being a port, a great port, there was always, of course, a big red light area with plenty of what were called sporting houses, almost all of which featured a piano, because the way to hold dances and sing songs and generate a congenial and convivial atmosphere, and therefore to sell more booze and generate more trade in that line of business, would be to have your visiting professor, your piano professor, who would knock out the ragtime hits of that time. In fact, some of the earliest examples of black music are to be found on the piano rolls of the ragtime professors. Legendary people like Tony Clark, who was supposedly the professor of the great Jelly Roll Morton from New Orleans. So New Orleans, on the East Coast, was much more a form of piano or orchestral music, whereas Mississippi and the Delta lands right through to Texas was where the steel string guitar came into its own. And around this time, the people that were singing were using a repertoire composed not simply of blues, but of story songs, spirituals, and folk songs, even timpanelli, pop tunes. They were able to compose a repertoire and establish a repertoire of many different kinds of songs, because they had to, if they wanted to work and if they wanted to make some money, then they had to please as many people as possible. I found myself in the course of my own career that you really have to please people. You can't play exactly the same thing all the time, because people say, I know what I like. But what they really mean is, I like what I know. So you have to really include things that people are familiar with, as well as your own original compositions. And in those days, of course, every bluesman was also a composer, if not a poet. The structure of the blues is such that it stemmed from repeated lines, very, very, very simple structures, because the old hymns that the slaves and the newly emancipated black people had learned to sing from were very simple patterns, using often no more than 3 chords, and this was exemplified also in the blues. But before the 12-bar form of blues, the classic form, arrived, you would find quite often simply one line repeated 4 times. I'm just going to give you an example of a prison song, which is exactly like that. It's just 4 lines repeated. It's the kind of thing that you'd have heard sung on Parchment Farm in the 20s, 30s, right through maybe to the 50s and 60s. Okay, here it goes. Another man done gone. Another man done gone, another man done gone, another man done gone. He's from the county farm, he's from the county farm, he's from the county farm, he's from the county farm. He had a long chain on, he had a long chain on, he had a long chain on, he had a long chain on. I didn't know his name, I didn't know his name, I didn't know his name, I didn't know his name. I won't won't you meet me at, oh Lord, the waterfall? I'm gonna meet you there. I'm gonna walk your log. Another man done gone, another man done gone, another man done gone, another man done gone. So from simple 16-bar forms like that, which is basically 4 lines of 4 bars repeated, came the blues, where 2 lines of 4 measures each, 4 bars each, were sung until the singer had the chance to make up a punchline which rhymed with the first 2 lines, and this became the standard 12-bar pattern. And you'll hear this in the early blues, you'll hear it in jazz, you'll hear it in rock and roll, rhythm and blues, right through to the present day in rap, blue beat, reggae. You find it throughout popular music, and that's one of the great influences that the blues had. So, who were the original bluesmen? Well, there were many legendary figures who never made any records, because along with many other innovations in the field of science and art, an awful lot depended upon chance, just as today it does. If you happen to be in the right place, at the right time, and your face fits, you stand a good chance. And some of the early pioneers just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Not all the great men were ever recorded. Some of those who were recorded were not so great. Some of those who became big names really didn't quite deserve it as much as many who never really became commercially successful. But amongst the very earliest pioneers who developed from the songsters of the minstrel times around about the very beginning of the 20th century became singers and exponents of blues, we've got people like Johnny Watson, or as he was called, Daddy Stovepipe number 1, who was born in Alabama around 1870, used to play an instrument, blue, which was he'd manufactured out of a stovepipe. Next came Henry Thomas from Texas, who was a very fine singer, and played guitar and also used panpipes to give rather an extraordinary effect. Has a wonderful song called I'm Going a Fishing. He was born in Texas in 1874. Another of the very early men was Gus Cannon, came from Memphis in Tennessee, and he played banjo. He was born in 1883, and is supposed by reputation to have made the very first black ethnic American records in 1901, none of which, unfortunately, have survived, but he later became popular with a jug band from Memphis called Gus Cannon and his Jug Stompers. Then there was a lady, Ma Rainey, the Chattanooga Choo Choo, who was born in Tennessee in 1886 and was became a very popular and prestigious vaudeville blues singer, which is another strain of blues, from the minstrel show blues to the individual street singer blues to the vaudeville blues singers and later to the big band singers all around the 20s and 30s. Well, she was born in 1886 and had some a big-voiced, red-hot mama, wonderful lady singer, supposedly very influential on the famous Bessie Smith. One of her big hits was C.C. Rider, or Easy Rider, which of course is incorporated into the famous film of the same name. Next on the list we've got Sam Collins, a very, very fine blues singer and guitarist from Mississippi, who was born in 1888. And then we have, 1887. After him we have the phenomenal Huddie Ledbetter, or Leadbelly as he was called, played the 12-string guitar, became quite popular, was patron patronized by Alan Lomax, the musicologist who recorded so much of the early music, fortunately for us, which you'll find in the Library of Congress records. Leadbelly became his chauffeur, so he was able to go, because Leadbelly was a big hulking man of well over 6 feet tall, who was a stunning prize fighter and boxer, and had twice sent people to the cemetery with his bare fists, and sung his way out of jail twice as well, by eulogizing the governor of the state when he happened to visit the jail. Twice he was exonerated and made his way in the field of music. He actually died rather a tragic death in Hollywood, where he was trying to emulate the career of Paul Robeson, who was also a stunningly good singer and made his way in films. Of course, Leadbelly was never able to accomplish that and became a kind of caricature of himself, really. But he was a fantastic singer with reputedly a repertoire over 1,000 songs, and was particularly accomplished on the 12-string guitar, although originally he was known as an accordion player, coming from Louisiana, which had been a French state, of course, in the early days. The accordion was a very popular instrument, and is still used today in Louisiana Cajun and Zydeco music. And we have other people like Pegleg Howell, who was born in 1888 in Georgia. He was sadly lost a leg in the course of a violent concert performance he was giving, when one of his legs was blown off with a shotgun. And also in the same year, we had Frank Stokes, who was another fine singer and guitar player from Memphis. And all these people were born before the beginning of the 20th century. But sad to say, none of them ever had the opportunity to record before the 20s were well underway, although jazz itself had already begun by the time blues was hitting the record decks. There was really a segregated form of taste, because music was made by the early blues musicians for race records, as they were so-called, companies like Paramount, Bluebird and Vocalion, simply for black people. But nonetheless, they sold many copies. So that gives you an idea of how blues actually began. It's a cultural form, it's a social form, it lends itself to improvisation, because, as I say, with having a repeated first line, it gave the musician and the singer chance to improvise. And so it's a music of improvisation, to improvise a third line which rhymed with the first two and was a kind of punchline. And there's often an awful lot of humour, sometimes a lot of double entendre. Also, it provided a language which black people could understand and white people couldn't, which was very important, because it could carry social messages and forms of protest which would never have been countenanced in the severely segregated southern states, especially in Mississippi, which was particularly severe. So blues became a form of protest, but perhaps most of all, it was an extremely emotional way of expression. You could really express your feelings, because they could, with the new steel-strung guitars, there was a possibility of bending the strings, making that cry, especially using a bottleneck or a knife in the form of Hawaiian playing. A singer could imitate his own voice and provide a second voice with the bottleneck or slide, while picking the rhythm out with his thumb on the bass strings and providing that second voice. So you have a form of improvisation, and a form of emotional expression. And the third key factor is the fact that blues has always been a rhythmic music. It was the first music that really swung in a cool way, and as such it has always survived as a form of dance music and a form of music which strikes the visceral elements of the human body. It gets you going, it appeals to your emotions, but it also makes your feet tap. Blues has always been a good form of dance music as well as a good form of expression. So for all these reasons, it was adopted as a universal language all over those southern states, right from the Pacific to the Atlantic.
Okay, kids, there you have it. The man, Victor Brox. Holy shit, is he not legit or what? When we were asked to develop content outlining the history and the influence of the blues, we could have gone in a lot of different easy directions. We could have essentially plagiarized from a variety of different books and created ourselves. We could have spoken with some professors, and we may have been able to find some blues people. But to have somebody like Victor Brox, who has lived and breathed every waking moment of his life within the realm of the blues, you just can't get a better substitute. And that is what we're trying to impress upon you. Stop just looking at your textbooks. Stop just listening to your instructors. You need to find your Victor Broxes. As many of them as you possibly can. You need to get to know them. They need to get to know you. If you do those things and start breaking the bullshit factory processes that have been shoved down your throat almost your entire life, your education will actually matter. You will actually learn something. Professionally, academically, personally, learn things. I'm going to step off my soapbox. We're going to be releasing the other 5 installments of Victor's History of the Blues, and each one gets better and better and better. So for now, good night, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I'm Jason Free, and you've been listening to Six Finger Learning.
You gotta love that woman. You gotta love her with a thrill. As if you don't, some other man will. You gotta love her with a feeling. Love her with a feeling.
Your system and other messages into the